right, just make sure it's working. Uh, Good evening, everyone. It's time to get started. I feel like we were only gone a few days, but I feel like we were gone a long time. So, yeah. It did, in some ways, yes, it did feel like a long time. Yeah, I know, I know we had a lot going on during that trip, so, but we missed you guys, and it's good to be home. Not only home in Castledale, but home here with you guys. Um, so let's get started with some songs. 129. No, no one, we all know what that one was.
You stole my song, David.
Oh, well,
Really?
if you were late,
That might be a little bit illegal.
it might be a little bit.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But we're going to go ahead and sing all five tonight. One reason I like Amazing Grace is because it really tells a story. It tells us where we were when we received God's grace and where we're going because of God's grace. So that's why I like this one. But let's go ahead and sing it all the way through, all five. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. All right, our next song before Dawn leads us in prayer will be 71. As the deer. Another favorite of mine because it has its roots there in Psalm 42. That's the header of the song. And when you read Psalm 42, you see that the psalmist is going through a pretty dark time in his life. And when I discovered that psalm, I was going through a pretty dark time myself many years ago. So that's why I like this song. But we'll sing both verses and then we'll have our opening prayer. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart. Okay, I think we got sound on this one. It's a little harder to work with because it picks up my voice a lot more, and I don't like hearing myself. I failed to mention, in case anyone hasn't got the proverbial memo, Maria's son passed away today. I think it was today, the text said, right? Yeah, it was today. So keep her in your prayers. Sounds like she's flying to Dallas because that's where he lived, so just to be with the family. So just keep that in your prayers. So let's open to Mark chapter 14. That's where we're going to spend our time. We're still working our way through this gospel. As I was looking ahead to some things, we're going to be in Mark 14 for a good while because Mark 14 is one of the longer chapters in Mark's gospel. So be prepared to spend several weeks in this chapter. But here in Mark 14, we are moving toward the cross. At this point, we're only days, if not hours, away from the crucifixion. And we read in this chapter about events that lead up to that, teachings of Jesus that would lead up to that. And among the things we read about in that context in this chapter is verses 1 and 2, where really is the context of this chapter. We've already spent time with those verses, but I'm reminding us of them because it's here at this point where the religious leaders are actively seeking how they can arrest Jesus, how they can kill Jesus, and all without starting a riot among the Jewish people, because this is the Passover time in conjunction with the festival of the unleavened bread. So, since these things of chapter 14 are taking place during the time of those festivals, it's for this reason that what Mark also records in this chapter is an account of the last Passover meal that Jesus would enjoy with his 12 apostles. It's the meal that is more commonly known as the Last Supper. We read about that in verses 17 through 21, and in those verses, Jesus makes one final prediction of his betrayal. And it's that point about Jesus predicting his betrayal that we're going to spend time with today, where from verses 17 through 21, we are going to explore 2 points that Jesus made about his betrayer. Now we know the betrayer is Judas, but here in verses 17 through 21, he's not named. All we see is this word, the betrayer, the one who will betray Jesus. He doesn't name Judas, but we know that he has Judas in mind. So this point begins here, of course, in verse 17. I'm on the wrong page here. Verse 17, it says, when it was evening, he came with the 12. So this is one of those stage-setting verses. It's another timestamp, we might say. It's night, and more specifically, it's the night of the Passover meal when they're enjoying that meal, and it's the night before Jesus would be arrested and later crucified. So this is where we're at. We're only hours away from the cross at this point. So again, verse 17 is just a stage-setting timestamp verse. Any questions or comments on verse 17? Okay. So now we get into the points, beginning in verses 18 through 21. First point we're going to look at here in verse 18 is that the betrayer was one who was eating with Jesus. And so we're going to break this down. We'll start with that verse. It just says, as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. So this is where we really hone in on that first point. The betrayer was one who was eating with Jesus. Second point we'll see in verses 19 through 21. But again, we see some more stage-setting things there at the beginning of verse 18. What's the scene here at the beginning of verse 18? We're reclining at the table and eating. Well, it says reclining. Now, when you're reclining, what does that mean? You're relaxed, okay? What's your position when you're reclining? Okay, leaning against other people. So the text says they're reclining. It doesn't say they were sitting down at the table. They're reclining. They were leaning. Now, one reason for that, and this is important to know, is because in first century meals like this one, like the Passover meal, they didn't sit at these taller tables like we got over here. Tables were low to the ground. And at those tables, instead of comfy chairs like this one, you'd have more of what we think of as couches. Couches that were also low to the ground. So instead of sitting up eating like this, people were leaning sideways, possibly against each other. And that's how they were eating their meal. As Dean pointed out, it's relaxed. It was a very relaxed position, but it's the position of basically laying down, maybe up on your elbow. Now, what meal are they eating at this point? Well, they would be dinner, but what kind of dinner? Where are we at time-wise? Passover. So they're now eating the Passover meal. Before this point, Jesus had sent 2 of his disciples to get ready for the meal, made those predictions about who they would run into, lead them to the place. That's been done. All these preparations were done. It's mealtime. So then we move into the second part of verse 18. What does Jesus say?
He's saying that somebody's going to betray him. One of you will betray me. Who's eating with him?
Okay, so he says, one of you. Who's he eating with?
The apostles, 12 apostles.
The apostles, the 12 apostles. So who's going to betray him? What? One of the 12. We've already run into some of that language already in this chapter. One of the 12. Now again, he's not naming the betrayer, at least not in this particular case, in this chapter. So he says, one of you will betray me. So next thing we have to explore is, what does it mean to betray? To go against, okay? Any other ideas? To turn him in. Now that hits it a little more specifically. It doesn't mean to go against, but to turn him in hits a little bit more specifically on this, because the word betray, it comes from a word that means to hand over. So applied here, the word is used by Jesus to say that one of his 12 apostles was going to hand him over to the religious leaders. Now again, verses 1 and 2, what are the religious leaders looking to do? Arrest and kill him. So this is what I've said before, verses 1 and 2, you have to keep them in mind when you're looking at this chapter. But what else does Jesus say? He says, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me, but what else does he say? One who is eating with me. So he's getting more specific here. He's not saying just one of you, one of the 12 will betray him, but one of you that's enjoying a meal with me. Now let me ask this question. If you're eating with someone, what does that say about your relationship with that person? Fairly close. That's especially true in the first century context. If you eat with someone, that indicates you have a pretty close relationship with them. So, looking beyond the words of the text, here Jesus is not only saying one who is eating with me, but he's more specifically saying one of you who I have a close relationship with. Now we know that because out of all of Jesus' followers, the 12 had the closest relationship with Jesus because they were following him day in, day out during his ministry. So if that's what Jesus has in mind, what he says here emphasizes that his betrayer would be someone who was close to him. Questions or comments on verse 18? Okay. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 18 about who Jesus' betrayer was is that the betrayer was someone who was eating with Jesus. In this verse, Jesus has shown that his betrayer was someone who was enjoying the Passover meal alongside him. As a result, as was already mentioned, his betrayer would be someone who is in a close relationship with Jesus. More specifically, as context shows, it would be one of his 12 apostles whose name was Judas. So, this is what brings us into verses 19 through 21, the second point. The betrayer was one of the 12. So we'll just read through these verses again just to get them in our heads. Again, verse 19, the text says, they began to be grieved and to say to him one by one, surely not I. And he said to them, it is one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl. For the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. So again, the point we're going to be seeing here in verse 19 through 21 is that the betrayer was one of the 12. So Jesus has made this prediction. One of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. Verse 19, what's the response from the apostles? Okay, they say that, but how are they feeling when they ask that question? Sorrowful. Do some people have the word sorrowful in their rendition? Okay. You have grieved? Yeah, I have grieved as well, but that is the idea of being sorrowful. Now, when you're sorrowful, what does that mean? You're sad. So what are the apostles sad about?
One of them is going to betray Jesus.
that one of them is going to betray Jesus. Jesus said these words. Go ahead, Dina.
Possibly also, Jesus thinks it's me. Because they all start saying, not me.
Right.
Not me, So somebody is going to betray him, but they're probably also grieved because they're afraid Jesus thinks it's them.
That's probably true. This is probably what's also going through their mind is, well, what if Jesus thinks it's me? Now, does Jesus know who's going to betray him? Yep. He knows. And we're going to see that here in just a minute. But I want us to look at the language just one more time from this verse. It says they began to be grieved and to say to him one by one. So who's also saying, surely not I? Judas. Judas already has the betrayal in motion. But he's still thinking this way. Surely not I. So he's among those who have asked this question. Now, one reason we might be able to assume that Judas is included here is because in Matthew 26:25, Matthew records Judas very specifically, him saying that question and asking Jesus that question. Let's just go look at it. Let's jump over to Matthew 26:25. I don't like hopping around, but we're going to do that because it's important. Matthew 26, verse 25. And if somebody wouldn't mind reading that verse.
And Judas, who was betraying him, answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? He said to him, you have said it.
Okay. So what are we seeing here in verse 25 of Matthew 26?
Oh, that Jesus knew who was going to betray him, and he told him. So.
And he told him. But we're still saying Judas still asks this question. He knows.
That couldn't have been. That wouldn't have been an honest question, obviously.
Right.
So he was just trying. He's putting on a front.
He is putting on a front.
Is what he's doing. I mean, he's not. Yeah.
Right.
Well, he's doing it for everybody else.
Okay, he's doing it for everybody else. He's already been caught. But he's still trying to deny it. But Jesus puts him on the spot. You have said it yourself. Questions or comments on that?
I wonder if Judas had a lot of grief at that point, or guilt, not grief, guilt.
There is some guilt, and we see some of that in what happens to him later, but it's not the right kind of guilt. At this point, he still has an opportunity to go back on the betrayal, and we wish he did. Jesus still gives him an out, so to speak. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. But yes, Judas is those. Even at the point that he's been caught, he's still trying to deny it. Surely not I, Rabbi. And Jesus says, you have said it yourself. So if you haven't already done so, let's go back to Mark. Anything else on verse 19 of Mark 14? So I jumbled my words. The apostles have responded the way they have. And what does Jesus say in verse 20 of Mark 14? There's one of the 12, one who dips with me. And you have in the dish. Okay. New American Standard has in the bowl. Does anyone else have in the bowl? Okay. All right. Well, that's okay. But yes, what we're seeing here is that Jesus is further identifying his betrayer. He doesn't say it's one of you. He says it's one of the 12. Now, we might say there's other people there, but we can't say that for certain. But what we can say for certain is that it is one of the 12. The 12 apostles that are with Jesus. But he adds this language, one who dips with me in the bowl. Now, with that being true, one thing we should understand here is that even here, Jesus is not specifically naming Judas as his betrayer to the rest of the apostles. Now, one reason we know this is because at this particular meal, all of Jesus' apostles would be dipping in this bowl. This was a common bowl that you dip something like bread in during the Passover meal. It'd be unleavened bread because that was part of the Passover regulations. But this bread had, or this bowl, this bowl had some kind of sauce in it that you would dip the bread in. We still see it at some restaurants today. But the point Jesus is making here is that it's still someone who's enjoying this meal that was going to betray Jesus. He doesn't name Judas here, but even though that's the case, and we're not going to go there, but in John's account of the betrayal story in John chapter 13, we learn in verses 26 through 30 of that chapter that at one point in the meal, Jesus dipped a piece of bread in the bowl. He gives it to Judas and says, go do what you are going to do. Now that's kind of a side point, but it's an important one. Because even knowing that Judas was going to betray him, Jesus still shows a degree of love toward Judas. You're going to betray me, Judas. Here's something to eat while you do it.
The commentary
Don, go ahead.
Looking at here on this verse, or on bowls and stuff, it said dipping bowls were particularly used at Passover. The dish here is probably Passover's dish with bitter herbs, which is kind of interesting.
I'm sorry, what was that last part on that comment?
The dish here is probably Passover's dish, bitter herbs.
Right.
Is what is saying was likely what they were dipping.
Yeah, and that's true. I ran into some of that information myself. It was a sauce that had like herbs and stuff in it, the bitter herbs that Don just mentioned. Anything else on verse 20? So we come into verse 21. Mark goes on to record some more words from Jesus, and where he gives a reason for what he said in verse 20. I'll just read it again. It says, "For the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." Okay, so verse 21 is a reason for what was said in verse 20. Now what Jesus says here in verse 21 is a statement that makes the point that the Son of Man was to go as it had been written of him. Now, I'll pause with that before we look at the rest of the verse. So we first have this image of the Son of Man. We've run into it before. Can anyone remind me where it comes from? Dina's putting you on the spot, Matt. Can you remind me what chapter? 7. Yes, the Son of Man language comes from Daniel chapter 7. Daniel has this vision. He's seen some worldly kingdoms come by, and then he sees this Son of Man coming down who receives a kingdom that would never pass away. But Jesus applies that here, and what does he say about this Son of Man? That he's going away. But how does he phrase his statement here? He says the Son of Man is to go just as what? As is written of him. Where was it written? In what scriptures? New Testament or Old? Old Testament. So he's beginning to make the point here that there was something written in the Old Testament scriptures that the Son of Man was going to go as it was written of him. Now, from the context that we're looking at, how was the Son of Man going to go? What needed to happen first? To be betrayed. So part of what Jesus is saying here is that the Old Testament scriptures had something to say about how the Son of Man would be betrayed, and then everything that happened after that. Now, since that's true, even though Jesus doesn't quote it here, one Old Testament scripture he may have in mind that speaks to this betrayal of the Son of Man would be Psalm 46, verse 9. Psalm 46 is a psalm of David, and David says that even his close friend in whom he trusted, who ate his bread, had lifted up his heel against him. Now, Jesus doesn't quote that here, but he may have it in mind because that verse is a verse that says that somebody who was close to David would betray him, work against him. Now, Jesus draws from that and says what he says here. So he's making the point that it had been written that the Son of Man would be betrayed, but then what else does he say about the person doing the betraying? It's better than he was not born. What does that mean? Or what's the point behind that? It's going to be bad. And what do you mean by eternity, Elaine?
He betrayed him. And he died in sin.
Okay. So Judas hears these words. How is Judas feeling at that point when he hears these words?
Well, not bad enough.
Not bad enough.
Touched in his heart enough.
Not touched in his heart.
His heart was hard.
His heart was hard. So what Jesus says here is this is the out that Jesus gives to Judas. Be careful, Judas. Now, he doesn't use these words. But this is the last warning that Judas receives, to abandon that plan. Because the consequences of that are going to be worse than having never been born at all. Eternity is in mind here. And we know Judas doesn't give up the plan. We'll talk more about that as we get closer to the end of Mark. But Jesus is making the point. It is better to not have been born than to suffer the consequences of what Judas' betrayal is going to bring. Anything else on verse 21? So the point we should see from verses 19 through 21 about who the betrayer of Jesus was is that the betrayer was one of the 12. In these verses, Mark and the words of Jesus have shown that the one who would betray Jesus was one of his 12 apostles. Now also, the words of Jesus show that his betrayer would suffer greatly for his choice to betray Jesus, to the point that not existing at all would be better than suffering the consequences for betraying Jesus. So when we put verses 17 through 21 of this chapter together, the point we should be left with is that Jesus knew who would betray him. The betrayer was someone who was eating with Jesus. The betrayer was one of the 12 of Jesus. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should learn from these verses is that Jesus knows who will betray him. Based on what we've studied in these verses, one thing we are reminded of is that Jesus has knowledge of who will betray him. Now, in response to this, we, like the apostles, might become grieved and say, surely not I. I won't betray Jesus. I could never do that. Someone similar to Judas that made a similar statement. Peter. Peter was gung-ho. I will never betray Jesus. But what does he do later?
He denies him.
Denies him 3 times. And we'll talk about that when we get closer to the end of Mark. But this is just some application. We can get in our heads, I will never betray Jesus. Won't you? Well, whatever happens, all of this comes down to the condition of our heart. You might say, I know my heart. I'll never betray Jesus. Well, no, you don't know your heart. Only Jesus knows your heart. He knew Judas's heart. So Jesus is the only one who knows for certain if we will or will not betray him. Since that's true, our responsibility in this is to guard against betraying Jesus. Because as Jesus has said, woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. I'm sorry, folks, I can't give you a happy application of these verses because it's not a happy section. Jesus is talking about who's going to betray him. And so we have to simply put, guard against betraying Jesus, as Judas did not. All right, questions, comments on this not so happy section?
Yes, by my
don't do bad things.
Well,
Well, I think the happy application is Jesus still gave an opportunity
Yeah,
for an out,
yeah,
and he didn't take it.
that is true.
Well, and he does that for all of us.
He does do
He
that
does
for
it
all of us.
and even those that reject him.
Yep. As long as we're here, we have the opportunity to not betray Jesus. And that opportunity is given to us in these last words that Jesus says to Judas. And all 12, for that matter. Because he's talking to all 12 when he says these things. Anything else? All right. Matt, will you close us tonight?